Now, Dick, in your career, you have the expanded opportunity that not many dance teachers do, being a very articulate person who writes well, and you have written for dance publications. I think you have a newsletter of your own, and you now write for a magazine. Won't you tell us about both those things, your newsletter and the magazine you currently contribute?
Well, with the advent of computers.
That's right, desktop publishing.
Without having to retype every page over and over again. I started a newsletter 10 years ago, and I don't know what I had in mind when I first started it. The first 2 or 3 copies are sort of peculiar. But then I got very involved in really going into the history of dance and into the individuals. And I've been writing them for some time. And I sometimes do not know what my students do for a living.
Now, when you send newsletters, do you talk about things that are currently going on, or it sounds like that you pick a topic or a person and write an editorial piece? Is that the basis?
Well, no, what I do, I start from the beginning and chronologically work my way through. Mm-hmm. And then on the back page of it, I have a little section called What's Happening.
I see.
And if some of my students are performing someplace, or they're doing something special, or a baby is born, I'm getting married.
I see.
I have a little gossip.
That's the news part, right.
And, but it comes out every month. It's free. It's put on the piano. And as I say, I have students, I do not know necessarily what they do for a living. And one day, this lady came up to me and she said, you know, I read your newsletter all the time. In fact, I read it to my class. And I said, what class is this? And she is a professor at St. John's University. And I said, well, why do you do that? And she said, well, I try to encourage my students to write, and I use you as an example. Here you are at this time, 60 years old and writing, starting to write.
So she teaches journalism or English
she
or
teaches creative writing
mm-hmm.
at St. John's University, Dr. Spittler. And so anyway, she said, how about taking a course? And I said, you know, I don't. At that time, she was Terry to me. I said, Terry, I don't have time to go out there. I'm teaching all these places, and I'm exhausted, and what have you. And she said, well, we'll do it on a one-to-one basis. She says, I'll give you the work from the textbook, and you'll go through from the freshman up through the thing. And then we'll do it together. So I started with the freshman course. You know, I had to write the paper on who your favorite teacher is and da-da-da and so on and so forth. And then you had to go through a descriptive kind of narrative, and you had to write one on something else. In the course of the event, now this is while I'm still turning out my newsletter, one of the questions, or one of the assignments were, this is after I finished the freshman course, sophomore course, and was getting into the junior course, because it went very fast, but there's only one person involved. And the assignment was create an argument and defend it. So I sat down, and the original title was Ballet versus Track and Field, because I think ballet had become no longer an art form. It was a matter of how high you could jump and how many turns you could do.
Pure athleticism.
Pure athleticism, yeah. You know, I'd rather watch the Olympics than go to the ballet. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I wrote this article on this. A lot of people, I had an art critic of Christian Science Monitor read it, and he said, you know, if you substituted the word art, or painting, for the word dancer, it's the same thing. I gave it to my cousin, the director out there. He said, it's the same thing in our business. And, you know, you really should get it published. And I said, how do you just send it in and publish it? Well, I gave a copy to a guy in the dressing room who knew the publisher of this magazine, took it over to me. I got a call that night, taking me out to dinner, and we were going to publish this piece.
And that magazine was what?
At that time, it was called Dance Pages. So they just wanted to change the title instead of ballet versus track and field to has ballet become track and field. And so that was okay with me. And so they published it. And in the meantime, I'm telling them about the newsletter, and I gave them all the copies of the newsletter, and they said, you know, as far as I know, no one's doing this, and any of the other dance publications, would you be interested in doing it? And I said, yeah, I guess so. You know, I was sort of dumbfounded. I certainly I never even thought of ever publishing anything.
And review for us some of the topics that were involved in your various newsletter articles. What sort of things?
Well, as I say, it was always historical, starting with the beginning of, quote, ballet with the beginning of Catherine de Medici, who was really responsible for ballet as we know it today, and how it progressed throughout the centuries. And I have now gotten it up to where I have covered the major companies in this country, and I've always made it quite clear that I'm dealing about how it related to dance in America. Lincoln Kirsten wrote in his book, said it would be impossible to write a history of dance because you would have to take every country and you would have to trace it all the way back, and it would take years and years of the greatest encyclopedias around, and it's quite true. So I have focused strictly on the beginning and the line that has come through to America. Mm-hmm. And so I took up the very early dances, the court dances, and then I went into the early ballet, the Romantic period, how that started, the demise of ballet in France, because France was the home of ballet, although very few people know that for the first 300 years it was in Paris that was ballet.
Gee, it would seem rather obvious since all of the terminology is in French, that it would be a great home place for it.
Yeah, and so anyway, according to the research I've done, the ballerinas begin to get all of the emphasis and all of the publicity and all of the art, and ballets were certainly choreographed only for the ballerina, not for the male dancer. And yet it was the male dancer. There was 100 women didn't dance, it was all men. And the men would dress in costumes and wigs and
just as in opera with castrati singers that took the treble parts, and it's called a hosenrolle, where they wore. Well, I guess that's where women wear pants, actually.
Well,
in Carabino.
They still do that nowadays in ballet. But anyway, the men were slighted, and so they went to other places, and most of them went to Russia. And when they got to Russia, they created a dance form. It was a Frenchman who started the Russian ballet, and all of their early teachers were either French or Italian. There were no Russian teachers to speak of. And Maurice Petipa, of course, was a Frenchman. And the first ballerina of Russia, the prima ballerina absoluta, which is an honor, which is...
That sounds pretty absolute.
Yes, absoluta. And she was an Italian, she wasn't Russian. And when we talk about the Russian ballet, what happened is because all the men left, and the women were making such demands that the costumers left, and the set designers left, the composers left. And the last major ballet in Paris at that time was Coppelia. They just came out with Coppelia. They searched the world to find the girl to play the part of Spagnolda. And it was an Italian, a little Italian girl. But I think they did about 3 performances, and this girl suddenly became an overnight success. And at that same time, the Germans invaded France, and so the siege of Paris was so bad, and so many people were killed and what have you, that there was no food, and this ballerina, who suddenly became an overnight success, died of starvation. And they burned all the major buildings, and somehow the opera house was spared, but it eventually burned down, and the one that's standing there now is rebuilt. But they made 3 or 4 feeble attempts to make ballet popular again using all women, and women now taking the part of the men, because the men had all left to go to Russia and Denmark and Germany, every other place. And so ballet just died out. And the last major ballet was called Sylvia. It was a feeble attempt to get people back into ballet. And it just didn't work. It just didn't work. So ballet just almost didn't exist in Paris until 1909 when Diaghilev brought
Sylvia, that came to it, that was at approximately what time? In the 1800s?
Oh, 1800s, yeah. Yeah. And so ballet, all these, the Russian ballet was, first of all, Perrault, who people have seen pictures of Perrault every time they go to the art museum, but they don't know that when Degas has his ballet class, the guy standing there with a stick in his hand is Perrault, and he was a dancer, he went there and was there for 10 or 15 years, and then Taglioni had gone there to dance, and she brought over Johansson, and Johansson became a very important teacher. And Petipa, who was not a very good dancer, who was living in the shadow of his brother Lucien, couldn't get a work in Paris on the bet, went there and became ballet master, but not originally. He was in the background. These other people would come and he kept him down. And finally he did become the main choreographer. And he is credited with a lot of ballets that I don't think that he would deserve to get credit for.
Well, all of this history of these people that you've dealt with in your newsletter that still goes on, that still continues, and it obviously covers a tremendous span of time and has a concise format that is one element is dealt with, is a far less intimidating situation for dancers to read and be involved in than having to get the entire encyclopedia of whatever it is, and so it serves a great purpose in that respect, I'm sure. And then the Dance Pages magazine took over your newsletter?
Yeah, and changed its name to Dance in the Arts.
Dance in the Arts, and this comes out how often?
It comes out every 2 months.
And the format is still the same, that it's this historical, chronological study of all this. Well,
but unfortunately, because of the amount of space I'm allowed, I have to cram an awful lot into a very small space.
Sure.
I think I'm allowed something like 1,500 words, so it doesn't take long for me to get 1,500 words.